Hi, I'm Lynsey. I am a dietitian working at Addenbrooke's Hospital, and I work with patients with liver disease and having liver transplants. So I did a study as part of a master's that I did here at UEA. It was the Masters of Clinical Research, and I looked at whether nutritional status assessed using a particular tool that we use at Addenbrooke's predicts survival better than just using BMI after patients have had a liver transplant. So there's some evidence that patients with a low BMI of less than 18.5, so underweight, and a very high BMI, which is obese class 3, have a greater risk of mortality after transplant. So it's their BMI before or at transplant that was looked at. But there's been no evidence of an association between mortality and malnutrition for any other method that we use for assessing nutritional status. So there's lots of different ways of assessing nutritional status. Using something like BMI is quite blinkered, because just looking at someone's weight isn't looking at the bigger picture and the holistic picture of patients. So there's different ways. A global assessment where you look at their intake, their function. You can look at measurements of body parts, so we look at mid-upper arm and how much muscle they've got on their arm, and also how strong they are, so we look at hand grip strength. And particularly with patients with liver disease, BMI isn't necessarily the best indicator of how well nourished they are. So on the left is a picture of a patient with ascites, which is where they have a build-up of fluid on their stomach. And a lot of our patients have ascites and edema, and it's caused by their liver disease. And people can carry up to 30 kilograms of extra weight, so it can massively change their BMI. It's hard to know exactly how much their dry weight is. Some patients just have that fluid until they have their transplant and it goes afterwards. Some patients we drain that fluid from regularly, but we never take the complete amount of fluid away. There's always some on board. So it's hard to know exactly how much they weigh. So we do other measurements to assess their nutritional status, but also monitor it, because if patients' weight is going up and down, it could just be changes in fluid. So we look at the distance around the midpoint of their right arm, fold of skin at the back, and we have a calculation where we can estimate how much muscle they have on their arm, and then we have reference ranges. In the same way as you have reference ranges for BMI that tells you if you're underweight, healthy weight, overweight, obese, we can see how well or over or undernourished patients are from these measurements. And then we also look at hand grip strength, so how strong they are, and we have reference ranges for these as well. So at Addenbrooke's, when we're assessing patients' nutritional status, we use this tool, which was developed by the Royal Free Hospital. So we look at estimated dry BMI, and if they've got a BMI under or over 20, and then that moves them into either side. And then we look at their mid-arm muscle circumference, and if that's less than the 5th percentile, which is way below average, or above the 5th percentile, and then that moves them into another category. And then we look at their dietary intake. So we look whether it's adequate, meeting their estimated nutritional requirements, inadequate, so between 500 calories and below their requirements, or negligible, less than 500 calories. And then we categorise them as adequately nourished, moderately malnourished or suspected of being malnourished, or severely malnourished. We can use the subjective override. So as clinicians, we can have guidelines and tools that we follow, but sometimes you just look at a patient and you think they're coming out as moderately malnourished, but actually they've lost 40% of their body weight, they're definitely severely malnourished. So you can subjectively override this tool. This information is presented at the weekly transplant MDT when they decide whether to list a patient for transplant or not. So it goes along with other risk factors like their cardiovascular risk, how functionally well they are, lung function, and everything gets taken into account, and they decide whether they're well enough to list or not. So my research questions were: does malnutrition before liver transplant increase the risk of mortality after they've had a transplant, assessed using that tool and BMI? And then also, does pre-transplant nutritional status assessed using that tool and BMI predict post-transplant survival and which one is better. And I used estimated dry BMI. A lot of the studies that are out there use wet BMI, but it can make a huge difference to what their BMI is. So it was retrospective because it was part of my master's course, and survival rate is actually really good for liver transplant patients. So 1 year survival is about 96.5%, 5 year survival is about 85%, so it's really good. So I needed big numbers as well to make survival worthwhile. I excluded patients that are less than 18 years old because they have a different survival rate. People that have acute liver failure rather than chronic liver disease, so paracetamol overdose, because they have a different survival rate. Having multiple organs, so having kidney transplant at the same time or small bowel transplant at the same time. And people that we didn't nutritionally assess as well because we wouldn't have had the data for them. So I looked at the predictive ability of BMI and that tool using receiver operating characteristic curves, and I compared the statistic from that to see which was better. And then survival, I used Cox proportional hazard models because I could adjust for confounding factors. Secondary outcomes, I looked at length of stay in the intensive care unit in hospital, and I looked at readmissions to the intensive care unit in hospital. And for those outcomes, I used one-way ANOVA if it was normally distributed, and the Kruskal-Wallis test if it was abnormally distributed. So this is the kind of flow of patients. There were 634 patients that had a liver transplant in the time period that I looked over, and 510 of them were eligible to be included. Only 2 of them hadn't been nutritionally assessed, so we'd actually seen most of these patients. 77 patients died in total, which was 15% of patients, and that was a median of 20.2 months, so I looked at 5 year survival. And you can see how many in each group died. So the obese class 3, 30% died, compared to a healthy weight where 15% died, and then there was lots of different causes of death where we could find the cause of death, so that was from the coroner's report when it was available. I looked at adjusted analysis for survival. So the table on the left-hand side, the graph on the left-hand side, is looking at the Royal Free Hospital tool, so whether they were adequately nourished, moderately malnourished or severely malnourished. And the top line, the best survival, were the patients that were moderately malnourished. The middle line were the patients that were adequately nourished, and the bottom line were the patients that were severely malnourished. And the risk of death for the moderately malnourished group, hazard ratio was compared to the well-nourished, and the hazard ratio was less, so they had a lower risk of death. It wasn't significant, but it wasn't miles away from significance. And the risk of death for the severely malnourished group, the hazard ratio was 2.6, so they had a higher risk of death, and that was a bit closer to significance again, but no, we use P is at 0.05 as the cut-off point. The obese group, most of them are grouped at the top together, and it was compared to people with healthy weight, so that was the reference group. The worst survival were the patients with obese class 3, so the BMI above 40, followed by obese class 2, and the best survival were the obese class 1s, so they had better survival. There was a statistically significant result, and that was the obese class 3, and they had a 7-fold, so hazard ratio was 7.24, so they had a 7-fold increase in risk of death. And then there was marginal significance, it was almost 0.05, that the obese class 1 had almost half the risk of death. So looking at the results, hasn't come out in red. That's just the results again, sorry. So all of the results together with the hazard ratios. I then looked to see, in a subgroup, patients that were nutritionally assessed 100 days within transplant. So because this was data collected from usual clinical practice, some of the patients the dietitian might not have seen for a year, and then they have their transplant. So their nutritional status was assessed a year before they had their transplant, and we don't know if it's changed in that time. And most of those patients were the ones that were adequately nourished, because they weren't sent back in to see us, and we weren't supporting them as much as the malnourished ones. So I did a subgroup analysis looking at closer to transplant, and when I did that, there was marginal significance that underweight BMI had a 5-fold increase in mortality. So P equaled 0.059. None of the other findings had significance, so that changed things completely, but obviously excluded a lot of people. There were 335 patients compared to 510. And then in a kind of post hoc analysis, I wondered whether the obese class 3 was skewing the results using the tool to assess nutritional status, because 5 out of 6 of them fell into that adequately nourished group. So maybe that was explaining why the moderately malnourished had better survival than the adequately nourished group. So I did an analysis excluding them, and for the moderately malnourished group, the reduced risk of mortality lost its marginal significance, as I suspected, and for the severely malnourished group, the increased risk of mortality came closer to statistical significance. So it was hazard ratio 2.7, and P now equaled 0.062 instead of 0.071. Secondary outcomes ended up being meaningless. So I didn't adjust the analysis for confounding for these. Discharges and readmissions to other hospitals wasn't included. So patients come from as far as Southampton to Cambridge, and they might be discharged once they're well enough to leave Addenbrooke's back to Southampton to recover, and might come locally back into Southampton if something minor happens and come back to us if they need to. And there was loads of missing data because it was retrospective and we weren't collecting that data clinically. So 30% ICU length of stay missing, readmitted to our hospital 4.1%, readmitted to ICU 39.4%, and also there was hand grip data missing as well, which was 11%. So I decided that those results were pretty much invalid. When looking at the best tool to use, both didn't come out particularly good as a tool to predict survival, but the Royal Free Hospital tool, which combines more than BMI, came out as having a poor predictive ability compared to just looking at BMI, which came out as having no predictive ability. And the poor predictive ability was statistically significant, so it is slightly better than just looking at BMI, which is what we suspected anyway. There was difference in baseline characteristics because it's not a randomised trial, it's collected retrospectively. Patients who were underweight and severely malnourished had more ascites because they can't eat as much. There's the patients who were most malnourished had the worst liver disease as well, because that tends to mean that they lose weight because of their disease as well. So it's all quite interlinked, and there were differences in the baseline characteristics. And the main limitations were the retrospective design of the study. Mortality as an outcome, I realised when I was analysing the data, was actually a limitation because not enough patients died. In the patients that were the ones that were severely malnourished, there was only 20 patients compared to 238 moderately and 252 adequately nourished. And the two extremes in BMI, the underweight BMI was only 17 patients, and the obese class 3 BMI was only 6 patients. So it might not have been powered enough to pick up a difference, a statistical difference. It was estimated dry weight, so not actual dry weight, and whether they died or not was censored from the last contact that we had with them at the hospital. So probably compared to other illnesses, that's better data because they all get followed up by our doctors and it all gets recorded in our notes. But they go to annual follow-up after they're a few years after transplant, so they might have died in that year that they haven't been seen and we might not know. And there was potential bias from me because I knew who was malnourished, who died. I was doing the analysis, so that could have biased the results as well.